Okay. Have you ever noticed how sometimes you just can't seem to shake off a certain behavior?
Hmm.
Like maybe you see a child doing the same thing over and over, even though it doesn't seem to be getting them anywhere.
Right, right.
Or perhaps you have a student who just can't stop trying to get attention, even though it disrupts the entire class.
Mm.
It's like you try to just ignore it, but then it just gets worse.
Yeah.
You ever wonder, like, what's the science behind why these behaviors just keep happening? And more importantly, is there a way to actually make them decrease?
Well, there is. And in this deep dive, we're going to explore a really fundamental concept called extinction.
Extinction.
Yep, comes straight from the world of applied behavior analysis, or as we call it, ABA.
Extinction. I mean, the name kind of makes it sound like we're trying to make a behavior completely disappear.
Right.
But, I mean, it's a very specific principle, and honestly, it's happening all around us all the time, even if we don't realize it.
Yeah, it really is. Understanding extinction isn't just for those who work directly in ABA. It can actually be a really powerful tool for anyone to understand why certain behaviors decrease when the expected outcome, doesn't happen.
Exactly.
It's like gaining a whole new perspective on those everyday interactions and maybe even figuring out how we might be accidentally contributing to these behaviors.
I love that. So for today's deep dive, we've got some great material on how behavior analysis can lead to lasting change. And of course, we're going to zero in on this whole idea of extinction.
Absolutely.
We really want to make this super simple for you.
Yeah, for sure. We want to break down exactly what extinction is.
Okay.
See how it plays out in different real-life situations,
Mhm.
from dealing with kids to what happens at work. And we'll also touch on some of the things to be mindful of when using it.
Love it.
So think clear explanations, not just textbook definitions.
Okay, so let's jump right in.
Sounds good.
What exactly is extinction in behavior analysis?
Okay, so in the simplest terms, extinction is when a behavior that used to lead to something, like a reward or a consequence, stops leading to that thing. So because of that change, the behavior starts to decrease over time.
Okay, I think I'm following.
So let's say you've got this coffee machine, right?
I do love coffee.
Every morning you put in your dollar and you get your coffee.
I need that reinforcement to start my day.
Exactly. The
But-
coffee is reinforcing that behavior of putting in the dollar.
Makes sense.
But then one morning you put your dollar in and nothing happens.
Oh, no.
You try again, nothing. What do?
Probably stop putting dollars in that machine.
Exactly. Because the behavior of putting in the dollar isn't being reinforced by getting the coffee. You stop doing it.
Okay, that's extinction in action.
Yep, that's it.
So it's like the behavior learns, hey, the old rules don't work anymore.
Exactly.
Do you give us an example that we see when we're interacting with people?
Sure, think about a kid who's figured out that if they whine or cry in the store, mom or dad will usually give them a treat or a toy to quiet them down.
Oh, yeah, we've all seen that one.
Right, so the toy or treat is reinforcing that whining behavior.
Yeah.
But if the parent decides to stop giving in to the whining and consistently doesn't give the treat or toy anymore,
Okay.
well, according to the principle of extinction, that whining should decrease over time because it's not getting them what they want anymore.
So it's not like an instant thing. The whining doesn't stop immediately.
Yeah, that's a really important point, and our sources emphasize this too.
Right.
It takes a while for that connection between the behavior and what they were getting to weaken. It's a gradual thing.
So it's a process.
It is, and there are some other really interesting things that often happen when you're using extinction.
Like what?
One is called an extinction burst.
An extinction burst?
Yeah.
What's that?
So this is where it gets interesting.
Okay.
Before the behavior actually decreases, you might actually see it temporarily increase.
Well, so it gets worse before it gets better?
It can seem that way, yeah. But it's actually pretty common when a behavior that used to work suddenly stops working. Remember our broken coffee machine? What might you do after it doesn't give you coffee a couple of times?
I'd probably press the button harder or try pressing it a bunch of times.
Exactly. That's the extinction burst in action. It's that initial surge in the behavior when the reinforcement starts.
So with a kid crying for a toy, the extinction burst might be like a super intense tantrum because the toy isn't appearing.
Exactly. And, our sources really stress that understanding this is key
Mm-hmm.
because this is often the point where people think, oh, this extinction thing isn't working, and they give in.
And then what happens?
Well, by giving in during that burst, they actually end up reinforcing that more intense behavior, which makes it even harder to deal with later on.
Oh, so it backfires.
Yeah, it can.
Yeah.
So knowing that the extinction burst is normal is super important if you want to stick with it and actually see the behavior decrease.
Makes sense. It's like that last-ditch effort to get what they want.
Exactly.
So what else do we need to know about extinction?
Well, there's another important thing called spontaneous recovery.
Spontaneous recovery. What's that?
So even after a behavior has decreased a lot, or even seems to have disappeared altogether, it might suddenly pop up again later on.
Like it comes back for an encore.
Yeah, kind of. It doesn't necessarily mean that extinction failed, though. It's more like the behavior is just checking to see if the reinforcement might be back.
So what should you do?
If you keep withholding the reinforcement that behavior should disappear again, it's a good reminder to be consistent even if the behavior makes a brief comeback.
So it's like a little test.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, so you've got that gradual decrease, then that temporary increase, which is the extinction burst,
Yeah.
and then the possibility of that little reappearance, which is spontaneous recovery.
Right.
Anything else we absolutely need to know about the basics of extinction?
Yeah, it's really important to make sure we're not confusing extinction with just forgetting.
Oh, okay.
I mean, both of them can result in a behavior happening less, but the reasons are different.
Okay, I'm listening.
So extinction happens because the behavior isn't leading to the reinforcement anymore,
Right.
but forgetting happens because the behavior just hasn't been practiced in a while.
So like if a kid used to always ask about a certain cartoon character,
Uh-huh.
but then they just haven't mentioned it or watched it in a while, that's more like forgetting.
Exactly.
But if they keep asking about it and you consistently don't respond or put the show on, if that was a reinforcement, then that's extinction at work.
You got it.
So one is about what happens or doesn't happen after the behavior, and the other is about whether they even have a chance to do the behavior in the first place.
That's a good way to think about it.
Okay, so we've got a good grasp on what extinction is, but let's
Yeah.
move beyond kids and vending machines.
Okay.
Where else do we see extinction in the real world?
Oh, extinction, it's everywhere.
Is it really?
Absolutely.
Right.
It's a fundamental principle that pops up in so many different settings.
Like where?
I mean, we see it in parenting, of course.
Right.
But also in how teachers manage classrooms, how managers work with their employees, even in therapy.
Wow.
Basically, any situation where you've got behaviors that are being maintained by some sort of reinforcement, you're likely to see extinction at play.
So can we talk about some specific examples? Let's start with the classroom.
Okay, so imagine you have a student who's constantly calling out answers without raising their hand.
Okay.
Now, if the teacher has unintentionally been reinforcing this by acknowledging their answers, even if they remind the student to raise their hand the next time,
Uh-huh.
that attention from the teacher can act as a reinforcer.
Right.
Even negative attention can sometimes be reinforcing.
So how would you use extinction in this situation?
Well, the teacher could try to consistently not react or respond to the student when they call out. Of course, as long as it's not disruptive or anything.
Right.
So if the student is calling out mainly to get attention from the teacher, then over time, this behavior should decrease because it's not giving them what they want anymore.
Interesting. It sounds like that would take a lot of effort from the teacher to stay consistent.
Yeah, it does.
What about in the workplace?
Let's say you have a coworker who's always interrupting meetings with stories or comments that are completely off topic.
Oh, yeah?
And maybe they're doing it because they enjoy that little bit of social interaction or the reactions they get from others.
Right.
So extinction here could involve everyone in the meeting, including the leader, just not engaging with those comments and gently steering the conversation back on track. If they're mainly looking for that social attention, then those interruptions might start to happen less often.
It sounds tricky, though, especially at work. You don't want to damage relationships, but you still need to stay focused.
Absolutely. And that just highlights how important it is to think about the specific context whenever you're considering using extinction and be aware of how it might affect things.
Right.
How about at home?
Oh, yeah, with our pets.
Exactly.
Furry little bundles of reinforcement, I swear.
Think about a dog that barks at the door whenever it wants attention.
Okay.
If the owners always react by petting the dog or letting it outside even for a second,
Yeah.
they might actually be reinforcing that barking.
Oh, interesting.
To use extinction, they would need to completely ignore the barking
Ah.
and only give attention when the dog is quiet.
Okay, so no matter the situation, the key is figuring out what that person or animal is getting out of the behavior.
Yeah, finding that reinforcer that's keeping the behavior going is the most important first step.
That makes sense.
Before you can even think about using extinction, you need to answer that question. What is this behavior doing for this person in this specific situation? Is it attention? Are they trying to get out of doing something they don't want to do? Are they trying to get something specific? Once you figure that out, then you can think about whether and how you can consistently withhold it.
So it sounds like extinction can be a really powerful tool, but you need to be thoughtful and consistent when using it.
Yeah, exactly.
What are some challenges that professionals in ABA often face when using extinction?
One of the biggest hurdles is dealing with those extinction bursts.
Oh, right.
It can be super tough for parents, teachers, therapists to stay consistent when that unwanted behavior suddenly gets more intense.
I can imagine. It's like when you're already dealing with a behavior, you want to reduce, and then it escalates.
Right.
Your first thought is probably just give in to make it stop.
Exactly. And that's why knowing that the extinction burst is a normal part of the process is so important.
Right.
It helps those professionals anticipate it, have strategies for dealing with it, and stay consistent even when things get a little wild.
So you need a plan.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
And another big challenge is just being consistent.
How so?
Extinction will only work if you withhold the reinforcement every single time the behavior happens.
Because what if you're not consistent?
If you're sometimes ignoring the behavior and sometimes giving in, it can actually make the behavior harder to extinguish in the long run. Yeah, it creates what we call an intermittent schedule of reinforcement,
Okay.
which basically means the behavior is only reinforced some of the time.
Yeah.
And we know that behaviors that are reinforced on and off can be super strong and really persistent.
So it's like that coffee machine that only sometimes gives you coffee.
Exactly. You're going to keep trying even if it mostly doesn't work.
Right.
So yeah, consistency is key.
Got it.
And there's also the fact that when a behavior stops being reinforced, the person might feel frustrated or get upset.
Of course.
They might even try other behaviors to see if they can get what they want.
That makes sense if you had a way of getting what you want and suddenly it doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, you'd probably be pretty frustrated.
Right.
So ABA professionals always emphasize the importance of not just trying to stop the unwanted behavior, but also teaching new and more appropriate behaviors that can serve the same function.
So it's not just about taking away the old behavior, but also helping the person find a better way to get their needs met.
Exactly.
That sounds so much more helpful.
It really is, and that's why ABA professionals do what's called a functional behavior assessment.
Okay.
This helps them understand why a behavior is happening in the first place. You know what its purpose is. And that helps them develop an individualized plan for that person.
Okay.
And that plan might include extinction, but it will always include strategies for teaching and reinforcing those desired behaviors.
So that's a more holistic approach.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered what extinction is, how it works, some challenges.
Right.
What are some key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, even if you aren't working in ABA, you can start by just being more aware of the behaviors around you that you want to understand or maybe change.
Okay.
Pay attention to what happens right after those behaviors.
Okay.
And see if you can spot what might be reinforcing them. Like we said, ask yourself, what is this person getting out of this?
That's a really good point.
Then once you've got a better idea of the reinforcer, you can start to think about whether consistently withholding it would be a safe and appropriate strategy.
So for example, if your cat meows really loudly every morning until you feed it,
Oh, okay.
you could decide to wait until it's quiet for a few seconds before putting the food down.
Right.
That's a really simple example of extinction.
And if someone wants to try using extinction, what should they keep in mind based on what we talked about today?
Definitely be ready for that extinction burst.
Right.
Remember, the behavior might actually increase for a bit before it starts to go down.
Of course.
It's like testing the boundaries right.
So you can't give in.
Right. If you do, you might accidentally make the behavior even stronger. So consistency.
Consistency.
Write it out and stick to the plan.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And don't forget how important it is to reinforce those alternative behaviors.
Right.
So instead of just ignoring your cat when it meows, you could also give it attention and praise when it's quiet.
Okay.
That gives it another way to get your attention a better way.
That's a much more positive approach.
Right. You're not just taking something away, you're also teaching a new, more appropriate behavior.
I like that.
And of course, if you're dealing with more complex or difficult behaviors, or you're unsure about how to use extinction safely and effectively, it's always best to get advice from a professional like a board-certified behavior analyst at BCBA.
Great advice.
They can really help you figure out what's going on and come up with a plan that's right for the situation.
Okay, so to sum up our deep dive into extinction,
Sounds good.
it's basically withholding reinforcement to decrease a behavior.
Right.
It usually happens gradually,
Uh-huh.
but we often see an initial increase, which is called the extinction burst.
Uh-huh.
And there's always the chance of that behavior coming back for a bit, which is spontaneous recovery.
Right.
And remember to be consistent when withholding that reinforcement.
Yeah, that's super important for extinction to be effective.
Absolutely.
And remember, it's most effective and ethical when we focus on teaching and encouraging those alternative behaviors to replace the ones we're trying to reduce.
Okay, so here's a final thought for our listeners. Think about a time you saw a behavior kind of fade away when the reward or the outcome stopped happening.
Okay.
What was that behavior, and what do you think was keeping it going?
Interesting.
And now that you know about the extinction burst, how might understanding this help you deal with those challenging behaviors in the future?
Yeah.
Whether it's your own behavior or someone else's, it's really about understanding why we do the things we do and how those patterns can change.
You know, these principles, they're happening all the time. They shape how we interact and how we behave in ways we might not even realize.
Right.
So just by understanding the basics of extinction, you're gaining a really useful tool for navigating the world around you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into extinction. We hope it's given you some new insights and practical ways to think about behavior change in your own life.
Yeah, thanks for listening.